Welcome back to Verbal Sparring and welcome to another edition of the State of the UFC March 11th, 2026. In this version of the State of, we will be taking a look back at UFC Houston, UFC Mexico, and UFC 326. And if you are new to the channel and new to this video series, it is a monthly video where I break down the past month's action on a fight-by-fight basis, take a look at the stats, how many knockouts, how many submissions, how many decisions, how many fights happened in each weight class, how were the rankings directly impacted in the aftermath of each card. Not to mention I discuss which newcomers to the UFC picked up victories in their debut fights. We take a look at where the pound-for-pound rankings sit and give a brief preview of what's to come in the next edition of this video series. So without further ado, we start with UFC Houston that took place at the Toyota Center in Houston, Texas on February 21st, headlined with a pivotal middleweight clash between Sean Strickland and Anthony Fluffy Hernandez. This event would feature 14 fights with 4 knockouts, 1 submission, and 9 decisions. Of the 4 knockouts, 3 would come in the opening period and 1 would come in round 3, and the lone submission would come in round 2. Out of the 9 decisions, 7 of them were unanimous and 2 of them were split. As for the divisional breakdown, we saw 5 fights at the welterweight division, with 2 fights each at middleweight, featherweight, and flyweight, and 1 fight apiece at heavyweight, women's bantamweight, and women's flyweight. There was quite a bit of shuffling that would go on in the rankings in the aftermath of this fight card, even though it was a fight night, which is good to see. And first up is the middleweight divisional movement, as the 3rd ranked Sean Strickland would finish the number 4 ranked Anthony Hernandez via 3rd round TKO, and that would force Hernandez down from 4 to 6, which would result in Brendan Allen rising up from 5 to 4, and Israel Adesanya, the former 2-time champ, rising from 6 to 5. Uros Medic picked up another knockout victory, and this was by way of vicious first round finish over Jeff Neal. Medic would break into the welterweight top 15 for the first time in his career, where he currently sits at number 12, and Jeff Neal was removed from the rankings. Daniel Rodriguez would drop to 15, and Colby Covington, for whatever reason, would rise 1 spot from 14 to 13. Melquiades El Costa would keep his long win streak alive in the featherweight division, and this time it would earn him a spot in the top 15 by finishing the number 14 ranked veteran Dan Ige. Melquiades now sits at 13, and Ige would be removed from the rankings, much like Jeff Neal, the fight previously mentioned. In the 13th ranked Kevin Vallejos would drop to number 14, and we'll be talking about him at the end of this video. In the heavyweight division, the polar bear Sergey Spivak would get a bounce back win via decision over Ante Delia, and he would rise up 1 spot from 7 to 6, switching places with Rizvan Kuniev, and Ante Delia would drop 1 spot in the result of this loss. And then there was honestly just a bunch of random movement in the back half of the heavyweight top 15, but I can't really give you any rhyme or reason. And lastly, in the women's bantamweight division, the hottest thing going in that weight class right now, Jocelyn Edwards would pick up another finish victory, this time a revenge win over Nora Cornell. Jocelyn would rise up 3 spots from 14 to 11, Nora would drop 1 spot from 12 to 13, which would force Mayra Bueno Silva down from 11 to 12 and Miesha Tate down from 13 to 14. And the UFC would stay on the road, as the next week they would go south of the border to Mexico City, Mexico for UFC Fight Night, Brandon Moreno versus Lonnie Kavanaugh. This card would feature 13 fights with 5 knockouts, 1 submission, and 7 decisions, and of those 5 knockouts, 3 of them were in round 1 and 2 of them were in round 2. That lone submission would happen in the first round, and of the 7 decisions, 6 of them were unanimously agreed upon and 1 of them was a split. We saw 3 fights apiece at bantamweight and flyweight, 2 fights apiece at middleweight and featherweight, and then 1 fight each at lightweight, women's bantamweight, and women's flyweight. As for the rankings, Lonnie Kavanaugh would absolutely launch himself up in the flyweight division on short notice, getting a win over the former 2-time champ Brandon Moreno. This bonus earning performance from Lonnie Kavanaugh would also see him rise all the way up to the number 6 spot in the rankings, getting there from an unranked position. And with the loss to Moreno, he would just drop 1 spot from 6 to 7. We saw Asul Mabayev, who was originally slated to be Brandon Moreno's opponent, drop from 8 to 9, and then we saw everyone ranked 9 through 14 drop down in this division as well. And in the bantamweight division, David Martinez would improve to 3-0 in the UFC, with his second of those 3 over ranked opponents, and this one would come over the former title challenger Marlon Chito Vera. And they would essentially just switch places. Martinez now sits at number 9, and Marlon Vera now sits at number 10. And the final event of the 3 was UFC 326 at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, Nevada, headlined by a BMF championship bout and rematch between Max Holloway and Charles Oliveira. This card would have 12 fights with 3 knockouts, 1 submission, and 8 decisions. There were 2 first-round knockouts and 1 in the second, and that lone submission would happen in round 2 as well. And of the 8 decisions, 7 of them were unanimous, and 1 of them was a split. There was 3 fights in the middleweight division, 2 fights at light heavyweight, bantamweight, and flyweight, and 1 fight at featherweight. We saw 2 divisional rankings be impacted in the aftermath of UFC 326. With the middleweight division seeing the most amount of movement. First, in the co-main event, Caio Borralho would get a bounce-back unanimous decision over Renier de Ritter, which would allow him to rise up from 7 to 5, which would then bump up the former champion Adesanya from 5 to 4, and force Brendan Allen down 2 spots from 4 to 6, and Anthony Hernandez down from 6 to 7. And in the back half of the middleweight division, Gregory Robocop Rodriguez would pick up another knockout victory, and this one was absolutely vicious as he would avenge a loss a few years in the making against Bruno Ferreira. Robocop would switch places with Paulo Costa, where he now sits at number 12, and Costa, the former title challenger, now sits at 13, even though his next fight is going to be at light heavyweight. And lastly, in the bantamweight division, Raul Rosas Jr. at 21 years of age is now in the top 15 of the bantamweight division, and that is thanks to his unanimous decision win over Rob Font. Raul would crash into the number 13 spot, removing Font from the rankings, and then we would see Montel Jackson rise from 15 to 14, and Farid Basharat would break into the rankings for the first time as well, where he currently caps it out at that 15th and final spot. And now let's bring these 3 cards together and get our totals. Over the course of these 3 events, there would be 39 fights with 12 knockouts, 3 submissions, and 24 decisions, meaning that there was just a 38.4% finish rate. Of the 12 knockouts, 8 of them would happen in round 1, 3 in round 2, and 1 in the third. And with just 3 submissions, there wasn't a lot of variety, as 1 would happen in round 1 and 2 would happen in round 2. And out of those 24 decisions, 20 of them were unanimous, and 4 of them would see the judges differ with a split. We saw 2 divisions tie for the most amount of action over these 3 events, and it was the middleweight and flyweight divisions, both of them with 7 fights apiece. Then we saw 3 divisions with 5 fights, that would be welterweight, featherweight, and bantamweight, followed by 3 fights at lightweight, 2 fights at light heavyweight, women's bantamweight, and women's flyweight, just 1 fight for the big boys at heavyweight as they continue to have a very depressing year, and the strawweight division would come in with the least amount of action, and they quite literally couldn't get any lower as they would have a goose egg 0 fights. And now let's take a look at where the pound-for-pound rankings sit after UFC 326. For the men, Islam Makhachev is still the king, sitting at number 1 in the world, and we are still awaiting what his next title defense will be, and his first in the 170-pound division. Sitting at number 2 is Ilia Topuria, and we just learned that he will be putting up his lightweight title against Justin Gaethje, the interim champion, in the main event of the UFC White House card in June. Alex Pereira, who sits at number 5, will also be competing on that White House card. He will be in the co-main event against Cyril Gane, fighting for the interim heavyweight title. We see Tom Aspinall and Merab Dvalishvili switch places at 7 and 8. Joshua Van and Dricus du Plessis both would jump up 1 spot each, and that is because Charles Oliveira would force them up because he now sits at number 12 following his BMF championship victory over Max Holloway, where he would dominate him in the main event of UFC 326. And speaking of his opponent Max Holloway, he would take a major dip in the pound-for-pound rankings, dropping from number 10 all the way to number 15, capping it out. And for the women, Valentina Shevchenko still sits atop the throne at number 1, and we see a little bit of shakeups between 11 and 14 as Tatiana Suarez would switch places with Raquel Pennington, and Yan Xiaonan would switch places with Rose Namajunas, and capping out that 15th spot is Macy Barber, who is slated to fight in less than 3 weeks' time in the co-main event of UFC Seattle, as she will be taking on former foe and former flyweight queen Alexa Grasso, who is right in the middle of these pound-for-pound rankings at number 9. And now let's transition into which UFC newcomers would pick up victories in their debut fight, and there's quite a bit of them, and most of them happened at UFC Mexico. But first, we go to UFC Houston, where Jean-Paul Labosnoyani would pick up a split decision win over the veteran Philip Rowe, and he is in the welterweight division. And then at UFC Mexico, we would see 5 fighters not only debut, but get victories in their first fight in the promotion. First was Damian Pinas getting a first-round TKO over Wesley Schultz in the middleweight division. Then in the women's flyweight division, Regina Turin on 3 days' notice would take on Ernesta Karachkaita and pick up a unanimous decision victory. Javier Reyes would defeat Douglas Silva de Andrade via first-round TKO in the featherweight division. Ryan Gandro would knock out Jose Medina in round 1 in less than a minute. That was in the 185-pound middleweight division. And at flyweight, Imanol Rodriguez would knock out Kevin Borjas in the second round. So 4 of those 5 debutants would not only get victories, but they would get stoppages. And there was one debutant at UFC 326, and that was Alberto Montes. He would defeat Ricky Turcios via second round submission in the featherweight division. And which events will be covered in the next edition of the State of? Well, it will be UFC Vegas 114 coming up this upcoming weekend at the time I'm recording and releasing this. And that will be headlined by the number 11 ranked Josh Emmett and the 14th ranked Kevin Vallejos in a pivotal back half of the featherweight division clash. The week after that, the UFC will head across the pond to London, England, as the number 1 ranked Movsar Evloev will be taking on the 3rd ranked Lerone Murphy in what is all but guaranteed to be a title eliminator, at least I sure hope so. And capping out the month of March will be UFC Seattle, headlined by the former 2-time champion and number 4 ranked Israel Adesanya and the heavy-hitting number 14 ranked Joe Pyfer. So that is it for the March 11th edition of the State of the UFC, and I hope you all enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new, as every single month I will be releasing content such as this, not to mention every single week I break down and discuss the biggest and best fights and storylines heading into each weekend. I recap the most meaningful results in the aftermath of every card, and I give my thoughts and opinions on MMA news and fight announcements. You can also join the community on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok, as well as like the Facebook page Verbal Sparring MMA, and you can follow on your favorite audio listening platforms such as Spotify and Apple, where every Monday and Friday podcast episodes release there. Have a great week, and I will see you all in the next video.